There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
I have a really interesting guest, Kezia from Ohio, making her debut appearance on Bite Size Book Chats. Welcome, Kezia.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me here.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to come. And you are here. This is going to be a fun and interesting conversation because you are here to rave about a book that you loved by an author where I didn't get along with another book by that author. So I'm giving you a big challenge to tell me that I need to give this author another try. So we're going to talk about the novel Maybe in Another Life. Taylor Jenkins Reid. It was her, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, that I didn't get along with and couldn't finish. But this one sounds really interesting. And your enthusiasm in your review made me approach you to say, hello, I'm your Goodreads friend. Would you come on the channel? So here we are. So tell us about Maybe in Another Life, Kezia.
Hey, so Maybe Another Life is really about the concept of decision making and how we always think that maybe if I made this decision, I would have had better circumstances, or I would have just, everything would have been better. So we follow Hannah Martin. Her life is a bit chaotic from the start of this book. She just ended a really terrible relationship. And as we progress through the book, we understand why she's this way. But yeah, so from the start of the book, we follow her and her journey. She goes back to LA because, things aren't going well. She goes back to LA to kind of start a new life. Luckily for her, her best friend lives there, and her husband, her best friend, is really, really supportive. And she's also really excited to meet up with her ex back in high school. His name is Ethan. So they go to this bar, and there's two choices. She either stays with Ethan or she lives with Gabby. And
so she goes to the bar with her girlfriend and that friend's husband, and the ex, or meets the ex-boyfriend from high school at the bar. So there's the four of them there.
Yes.
Kind of like double dating, but or whatever.
Yeah.
And approximately how old would she be at this stage? She's out of high school, so is she like in her 20s?
She was like 29. I remember.
Okay, around 30. Okay. And it was published in 2014. Is it kind of set that close to the present?
Yeah.
There's nothing that made you think.
2014. I was pretty young, so I don't know what was happening.
I am very jealous that you were pretty young in 2014, but good for you.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of backstory before we get to this very important night out at the bar?
Or not really.
It's okay. So that's
yeah,
pretty early in the novel. And then tell us about the rest of the novel, because this is where the structure gets really interesting. The novel is two parallel, alternate timelines. If she goes home with her girlfriend and the husband, what happens for the rest of her life? Or if she stays and continues drinking with and talking with her ex, and then following that timeline. And the rest of the novel is reading both of those kind of in parallel. Is that right?
Right.
Okay, great. And so what was it like reading it? You really connected with the story, didn't you?
I really, really did. I think it's because I had expectations that one universe was clearly going to be better. But no, they both had their downs and ups, and it was really like, no matter what decision you make, something's always going to come up. You're never going to have this perfect life. And that was what really resonated in me. Like, oh, this is not a perfect, like, this life was way better. It was not. Like, you can never be ready for what life throws at you. And it's so interesting how she kept saying that in both universes, showing how, like, no matter what, life is never going to be perfect,
The parts of it you found to be really moving as well. There's a line from your review. I'm going to link to Kezia's Goodreads, but I'm also going to link directly to her review of this book. And there's one place where you write, it's a really wonderfully written review, and you write, you write, cue the waterworks.
Yeah. Her family. Oh yeah, her family was definitely a major plot.
She had a tough life in childhood. Okay. And so how that affects her in both timelines is explored.
Right.
There's a lot of story, there's a lot of plot here, but did you feel it seemed like you really cared deeply about the character or the main character or other characters?
Yes, I mainly cared about the main character.
The main character, and you were rooting for her.
Right.
In both timelines or in both alternate stories.
Right. Both timelines were good for her. I feel like both things that happened really grew her. Like there was so much growth in both timelines.
And I just think that that's a real accomplishment for a writer to do a parallel alternate timelines and for the reader to be equally invested in both.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. It's amazing. Especially
I don't know if I've ever read a book like that.
Right.
Have you read any other book like this? The only one I can think of is a British novel from about 10 years ago, 15, maybe, Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. And it's not exactly like this, but the protagonist is born maybe during World War I and then is a young woman by World War II. And she keeps dying. It's like in the first chapter, she dies as a baby. And then the next chapter is she's born again, and then she dies when she's 7. And then the next chapter is she's born again. And so it's all these alternate lives that this one character leads. So you might enjoy that. It's quite a bit different, but I loved that one. So I can't even remember what I didn't like about the 7.5 Lives of Evelyn Hugo book, whatever. There's so many books came out the same year with 7 lives or 7 husbands. But I think what I really didn't like about that one was I don't really like reading fiction about movie stars.
Okay.
I think that's what turned me off. So this sounds very different, and I'm going to give it a try. So Kezia, you did a good job. You sold me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well done. So I hope that you will come back, please.
For sure.
I'm delighted to have Joseph from Calgary back, and he is not only from Calgary, he is from his fabulous literary blog, Rough Ghosts. Joseph, welcome back.
Thank you.
And this worked out beautifully because we are here to talk about a work of translated Norwegian fiction that he has recently read and reviewed. I will link not only to his blog, Rough Ghosts, but also to his specific review on this. And I acquired it and planned to read it in March. So I nabbed him for a review on my bite-sized book chats just before I started myself. And that is The White Bathing Hut by Thorvald Steen, translated from the Norwegian by James Anderson, and one of those, yet another gorgeous book from Seagull Books. Take it away, Joseph.
This is a novel that deals with the issue of disability. So it's the story of a man about 60 who suddenly gets a call from a cousin he didn't know he had, who informs him not only that she existed and she knew about him, but that their families were kept apart, and that he had an uncle who died of the same condition that he has, and that his grandfather, their mutual grandfather, had also died of the same disease. He had grown up without anybody talking about it. It was a taboo subject. Once he was diagnosed, his parents just said, let's just pretend this doesn't exist. And it's a muscle wasting disease. And it has
muscular dystrophy, right?
Yeah, a rare form. And so it has caused him to increasingly become unable to walk. And he's using a wheelchair, but he's just lost all of his muscle control. And shortly after she calls, you skip ahead a few weeks, and he's on his own. His wife has left for a week. She's a geologist, and she's out in an area without phone service. His caregiver has gone on holidays for Christmas, and his daughter's out of town with her boyfriend. And he's busy at a desk, and he hasn't put the brakes on his wheelchair, and he leans forward to find a spot on the map, and he just tips right over onto the floor. So the bulk of the story is actually narrated while he's on the kitchen floor, not knowing if anybody will find him in time, and going back through, his childhood, the diagnosis, but also through the weeks that had taken place since his cousin called, when he's confronted his mother, he's done a number of things. So he pulls together this story from the floor, occasionally going back to his position on the floor, which is almost poetic and spare, where he tries a couple of times to get up and, that kind of thing. It's beautifully told. It's very, very spare. It's not overwrought in any way. And it's not strictly chronological or anything, but it just fills in all these gaps as he's sorting out really for himself this condition and its genetic history, because his daughter has also looks like she's got it as well.
Yeah, it just sounds really incredibly powerful. In your review, you mentioned that there is some poetry in it. Is that right?
Well, it's not poetry. It's just that it's very spare and poetic-like. These segments where he's on the ground have a different tone than the sort of straightforward. Well, it's not really straightforward prose, but it's a spare prosy. It has a very resigned or a resilient kind of personality. It's not as depressing as it sounds when I describe it, because he's just such a great narrator. But these segments where he's looking at the floor, he's noticing a fly, it's all this very floor level view, looking out the window, and it's very much about the body, how many bones are in the hands and in the feet, and it goes into this different sort of mood when you have these interludes where he's right on the floor and thinking about his physical state.
Well, I've decided that you're my go-to person for fiction that sounds depressing but actually isn't, because I remember the last time you were here, it was a similar, not theme or anything, but I remember you saying it sounds depressing, but it's really not. And that's the kind of fiction, the kind of literary fiction that I seek out. So is it a spoiler to talk about the title? What's The White Bathing Hut?
It's not a huge factor in it, I don't think. It refers to, I think, a photograph he finds, because he's trying to find out information about this uncle that he never knew, and his grandfather. He had been told that his grandfather was an alcoholic, and that was why his grandmother left him. Whereas probably he was possibly developing the early signs of this illness. And if they thought it was an illness, they didn't want to be associated with him at all. But the white bathing hut is something he sees in the background in one of the photographs. It isn't a large image in the book. At least I didn't think so, but
What does loom large in the story is the intergenerational shame and stigma. Secrets and lies around disability.
Yeah, and it's, like I said, it's very spare. So he picks these small vignettes that he tells. He volunteers, or he works, I think, at a psychiatric hospital, which kind of brings in the question of the eugenics and mental health history. Now, he doesn't flesh that out, but it's in there. And, he's quite upset about the treatment of the inmates. And it's right around the time that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was out. He would be about 6 years older than I am. So I found a lot of the cultural references of the character and the author were things that I got. The Ramones at one point, and so it has these contemporary elements. But when One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came out, it was at that time of deinstitutionalization and that. So he sees somebody having shock treatment, and he's quite upset about that. But that's also where he first meets the woman who will become his wife.
And so then the present of the narrative is quite contemporary to present day, or?
Oh, it is.
It is present
it
day.
is
Okay.
quite contemporary. And he's looking back over his life. And I don't know when the book came out, but not too many years ago.
Yeah, I should have said that at the beginning.
And
I just checked. It came out in Norwegian in 2017 and this translation 2021.
Yeah, so really it's a fairly recent book. These attitudes are not gone, right?
Exactly.
They're still there. And that's the thing, is that, his mother still refuses to speak about it.
Yeah. Now, Thorvald Steen, I've never heard of him until I heard about this book, but he's quite a well-known novelist, Norwegian novelist, and quite well-known in translation. Where have I been?
I haven't read him before, but I did look him up. And I know Siegel has a couple of his historical books.
Historical novels, very well known for, and he's written children's books and poetry, and
because you can tell he's got a poetic background, and it is quite spare. So these vignettes and scenes actually tell a lot. And there's the contemporary events, like the recent past few weeks where he's gone to visit his mother, but also going back into his past. And when he was young, he was a skier, and he had a very good chance of being a competitive ski jumper. And his daughter as well, there's a scene where she's dancing, when she's really little. So this is a family where physical ability was highly praised, and, it's part of that sort of Nordic community. So this physical loss is particularly difficult. But there's a scene where his wife, and I think she's still his girlfriend at the time, finds out she's pregnant. And it's dealing with that idea of, do we have the child? He knows it's a genetic disease. He doesn't quite know how it comes down to him, but there's the chance that the child will have it as well. And even falling in love with someone, he talks at times about, I thought nobody would ever love me. I was going to be alone forever because I have this disease. And, his body was already becoming distorted in shape by the time he was in his 20s. And it deals with these small things that happen in a person's life and the choices they make because they have a disability. And I think that's why the character is such a strong character, because he does have this wife. You don't really see that much of her, but obviously she's been dedicated and stayed with him, and, the daughter, and he's over the years had to kind of pull back in what he's able to do. At this point, he's a freelance journalist, so he can work from home, but still been able to have a quality life. And that's really important, because it shows you that just because there's a disability, it's not necessarily cognitive at all, and it's not something that you can't adapt to. But the society really that he portrays really still is uncomfortable with people in their presence who are disabled. And society still does not deal with particularly these kinds of visible disabilities very well.
Yes, this is not a peculiarly Norwegian story. It could be transposed to.
I mean, even in Canada, in Alberta, we have a history of eugenics. I think it was only in the 70s that they stopped that. It was sterilization of people with intellectual disabilities and Indigenous peoples. I tried to bring that out a bit in my review because, a small book like this has a lot of things to think about.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for telling us about it.
Okay.
What a wonderful way to start the new year. I'm filming this on about January 11th, and it's one of my very first bite-sized book chats of the year, and it's with the lovely Nancy of the preeminent book blog, The Literate Quilter, joining us from the Detroit area. Nancy, welcome back.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me again, Sean. It's a privilege.
It's a privilege, yes, for me. You have recently read a fascinating work of nonfiction. I guess it's a memoir, and it doesn't come out until maybe April, so we'll put this up around that time. It is called She Came from Mariupol by the German writer Natascha Wodin, translated from the German by Alfred Kueppers. Obviously, in early January, Nancy and I had no idea of the fate that was to befall Mariupol, the war crime that was to be perpetrated and is still ongoing. It is impossible. It was impossible for me. It will probably be impossible for you to not overlay our knowledge of more recent events in this ill-fated city as we listen to Nancy talk about the horrific experiences of this memoirist's mother. And this is the memoir about her mother. Tell us about it.
Yes, when I saw this book, I was really fascinated. First of all, I'm fascinated with genealogy, and I'm a genealogist myself. And
did you know that I used to be one?
no, I don't know that. Of course, I'm just an amateur family, but I've done other people's genealogy too.
How fabulous. Well, that'll be a conversation for another video, but that's another thing we have in common.
And I was particularly interested because she's talking about a family from the Ukraine. And when I was in my early 20s, we had a neighbor who was from the Ukraine. And when my husband left for work, she would come running over to the door to talk to me. I learned a little bit about her life. I learned that she was taken from her family in place of her father to work in a German work camp farm. I learned that she thought she was sterilized at that time, and that after World War II, she met the man who became her husband, and they were lucky enough to be offered a chance to immigrate, and they came to the United States. I was so young and ignorant. I really didn't understand. I knew nothing about this history. And I thought, I want to understand more about what it was that Nadia had been through. And this was a very disturbing read. The author, Natascha Wodin, her mother had killed herself when Natascha was 10 years old. They had been living in a shed after the war as displaced people. They lived in a camp for displaced people. They lived in a ghetto. It was a very hard life. But she didn't really understand her mother's motivation and what she'd been through. So she kept trying to find more information about the family and putting together the memories she had of what her mother had said. And now, after all these years, with some kind of reality, some rooted in fact. And this time, she was able to find somebody who was a genealogist in the Ukraine who could help her. And so this is the story. This is the story of what she knew beforehand, her own experience as a child, finding this information and this person helping her, what she learned about her mother's family. And he even found a relative who had a memoir written by her mother's sister.
Wow.
So she was able to understand more about what had happened even before her mother was born. And it was very emotional for me to read this book because she's talking about living in a place that had been a beautiful city, very international. A lot of Greeks were there. And then came the civil wars in Russia, where you had the Reds and the Whites and the anarchists, and the battles happened in the city. And they had, over a course of, I think it was 3 to 5 years, 17 different groups claimed the city. Armies moving back and forth.
Occupied the city, yeah.
Occupied the city. Her mother ended up being deported under Nazi Germany to a work camp. And she describes what that was like, the deprivations, working 12-hour days, the hunger, the fact that the woman could be abused. She also has the story of her aunt who was at university and became involved with the political group and was found and deported to Siberia in her experience. So there's all these experiences under the Soviets and under Nazi Germany.
She got the worst of both of those.
Yeah.
The author, Natascha Wodin, she's described as a German writer of Ukrainian origin. At what stage of her life did she find all this information out? Middle age?
Just recently.
So in
Yeah.
her...
Yeah, she was late. It was later in life.
I'm guessing that a big part of this memoir is her coming to terms with that at a later stage of life, not ever
Right,
having known.
yeah.
And how do you process that?
Yeah. And understanding the post-traumatic stress disorder her mother and father had, which explained their behavior when she was a child.
Right.
She also talks about her own time where she was, how she was treated under German society as a Slav. Great deal of prejudice against her. I found it very riveting. It was very hard for me to put down, even though it is very depressing.
It doesn't sound too depressing for me. It sounds like the kind of book that I would really get a lot out of. Nancy, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
This is a special treat because this is the first time I have found out on Bookish social media another reader who is into royal biography. So I know that there's a sizable chunk of my viewers who are going to skip to the next interview, but there's also going to be a significant minority that are going to be really excited. So please welcome Julie from Melbourne, Australia. Julie, welcome.
Thank you, Sean. It's wonderful to be here.
What a delight. So we're talking about Princess Mary, and Princess Mary is the Queen's aunt. And the biography is Princess Mary, the First Modern Princess by Elisabeth Basford. And it just came out last year. So Princess Mary would be George VI's sister. Wasn't she the Princess Royal?
That's correct.
Absolutely. So I thought when I knew this biography was coming out that Mary was kind of a fairly boring member of the British royal family, but your review has convinced me otherwise. So tell us a little bit about the book and why she is interesting.
Downton Abbey is probably largely responsible, at least for the current views of Princess Mary. They referred to her as insipid and sort of forlorn, a very sad, tragic character who was suffering under the weight of an arranged marriage. Well, this biography shows that that is not borne out to be the case. Princess Mary is truly the first modern princess. And I believe that after reading this text. She did things that Lady Diana and lovely Kate Middleton and probably many others that I'm too nervous to mention are lauded for doing. I think she's suffering from what Cecil Beaton called determined lack of style, when in fact, I don't think she had a need for style. She had purpose, she had character, and she seemed to have defined herself through her work. Although she probably wouldn't have called herself one, she's got definite feminist leanings. She was the patron for a number of women's organisations, for Girl Guides, Red Cross, YMCA. There were at least 50 at the time of her death. And extraordinarily, she trained as a nurse in 1918. Now, this is a member of the royal family, and she was given the King's blessing. Her father, George V, thought it was probably a really good publicity.
Right.
But she was nevertheless enabled to study and train as a nurse.
And did she actually work?
Yes, she did.
She was born in 1897. And when did she die? In the 60s, right?
1965, relatively young. I think she was about 66.
That's right.
So she didn't have a particularly healthy life. She suffered from a number of ailments that, according to this biography, were brought about by overwork, exhaustion, and nervous conditions. But she certainly championed the causes of women. She was also the very first female chancellor of a university. So the University of Leeds received 11 or 12 honorary doctorates. I think that the fact that she's been overlooked is largely dependent on her appearance.
She wasn't ugly.
No, she wasn't.
She looks like, would you say she looks more like her Her
Her
father
mother.
or her mother?
Her rather stern-looking mother, who apparently they adored one another. She was the companion of her mother's throughout her life, but particularly supported her mother in later life.
Yes,
And I look at the photograph on the cover of this book, and she looks to me quite beautiful. But
yes, and the picture
Cecil
on her
Beaton says otherwise. And a
workplace.
number of artists also classified her as a bit dowdy, a little bit homely.
And I'm a big Queen Mary fan, so I've read two biographies of her in the last 5 years. The new one, or the one that was their companion. I did them in the reverse order, but The Quest for Queen Mary,
Yes,
which is you know that one, and then those were the juicy bits that didn't go into the actual canonical biography by the same author, James Pope Hennessy. So both of those. So yeah, I have learned quite a bit about her from those. Who was her husband?
Oh, Viscount
Earl of Harewood. Yeah.
Earl of Harewood, yes, but he's Viscount Lascelles.
Oh yeah, he was a stern-looking.
He's stern, but not undashing. Is that a word? He looks
Not
quite
undashing.
dashing to me.
They were married in
Harsh
1922.
making him look dashing.
She lived with her husband in his
Yes.
family estate, Harewood House.
Absolutely.
And that's far from London, right? Or it's not close. It's in West Yorkshire.
Yorkshire, yes.
And it's one of the few members that's that close to a sovereign that has lived that far away from London that I've ever known.
She had an apartment in London. I think George VI allowed her to make use of some apartment in Mayfair.
So, and they had two sons, right?
They had two sons.
This is my surprise. I'm going to spring on you here. This is a beat up copy of her son's memoirs. It's called The Tongs and the Bones, the Memoirs of Lord Harewood. So that's her oldest son, George Lascelles. He was the 7th Earl of Harewood. And this is his memoir. And I found it on Amazon. Don't tell anyone. I found it on Amazon, a used copy, very beat up. I don't know, price tags or whatever these are, for about $5.
Bargain.
And so this is the Queen's first cousin. And there's the family tree. And you should have heard me squeal like a princess when I got to the title page. Can you guess where this is going? It's signed.
Wow.
Signed from the Queen's first cousin. I almost fell over and I got it for $5. Apparently, she had a fairly important role during the abdication crisis, 1936, of her nephew. No, her oldest brother, David.
Yes, David.
Yeah.
Edward VIII. Had he abdicated.
When he abdicated. So what was her role there? Whose side was she on?
I hate to say fence sitter, but she had a great love for her brother. She supported her mother, and her father always was resentful of David's relationships with often older women, extended affairs, and the fact that David had tried to persuade King George to present Wallace Simpson to court, which he agreed to. But then after his passing, he decided that it was he gave them an ultimatum, essentially. And the ultimatum was, as everyone knows, accept me on my terms with Wallace or without. And Queen Mary said, well, without. But Princess Mary was one of the first who actually met with Wallace Simpson many, many years later.
Oh, okay.
A lot of the correspondence that we get in this biography, she refers to Wallace and we believe she asks after her health and her well-being, but it seems to me her prime objective was to maintain the relationship with her brother. She was a prolific letter writer, so there was a constant correspondence being kept up. No scandal with her and her marriage with her husband, adoration towards him. So, the fact that there's not a lot of scandal is probably another reason why people might have thought she was boring.
Well, there's many ways to be interesting, and not all of them are scandalous. Your work here is done, Julie. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean. It's been a pleasure.